talk to people about taking care of themselves like there's someone who they have responsibility for. And that's not a political issue too. It's an injunction to assuming that you have a certain intrinsic value, and that it's necessary for that value to manifest itself, for you to push yourself against the world, to challenge yourself, because otherwise what you're capable of won't manifest itself. It has to be developed. It has to be called forth by necessity, right? You have to pick a hard problem and try to solve it and push yourself against it and you have to try to do that truthfully and responsibly in order for what it is that you're intrinsically capable of and composed of to come to the forefront. And that seems like a very positive thing as far as I'm concerned, to encourage people to be responsible for themselves and for other people, and also to point out that you have a moral responsibility to do so for yourself just as you do for others. And I think that message has been very helpful to people. At least that's what they've told me. And it's predicated, the rule is predicated on the old Judeo-Christian idea, the oldest idea in some sense, that that there's a relationship between logos, which is truthful speech and communication, and bringing things into being from chaotic potential. That's the idea that's put forward in Genesis. And also the idea that men and women alike are made in the image of God, which suggests that, like God, we have the capability of affecting potential, affecting the possible future and turning it into the actual present, and that we do that, at least in part, as a consequence of our ethical choices.
Treat yourself like you matter. Talk to yourself like you would your best friends. Think about how you talk to other people. Think about, if you're watching this video, if you're a fan of this channel, you are probably pouring into so many people. You're giving them love, you're giving them encouragement, you're giving them belief, you're telling them they can do anything, right? Your friends, even strangers on social media, you're probably telling them that they can do things, right? You're believing in them, you're giving them confidence. But then what happens? You go home, you look in the mirror, and you're just telling yourself all the reasons why you can't do something. That voice inside your own head sucks, right? Telling yourself that you can't make it, that someone like you is never gonna do it. We don't treat ourselves with the same level of compassion, empathy that we have for other people. You wouldn't talk to your worst enemy the way that you talk to yourself. And that's a big problem. I think that needs to shift, that needs to change. Because as long as you keep talking to yourself like you're a piece of garbage, then you're never gonna accomplish anything great. We have to start to shift it. I had a whole bunch of issues in how I talk to myself. I used to say, well, I'm too shy, I'm too introvert, nobody's going to want to hear my story, my message doesn't matter, who am I to go off and do this? I have to have a huge ego. Even I'm sitting here filming in a parking lot. Like I would never do this. Only people with giant egos and loud mouths would ever do that, right? I'm still working to unwind all of that. But the more you can catch it and the more you can shift it, it allows you to go off and do great things, not just for yourself, but for other people. Because if you fast forward, if the way you've been talking to yourself for the past couple of years continues to be the way that you talk to yourself for the rest of your life, nothing changes. So how do we shift? How do we get to a point where, hey, we're actually saying better things about ourselves? Number one is you have to catch the voice. What is the negative voice? What are you saying to yourself? Because a lot of it are just, it's not intentional. It's these automatic thoughts. It's the subconscious thoughts. You come up with an idea of what you can do and immediately you shut yourself down without even noticing it. It's a default nature. Instantly, boom, no, I can't do that. No, you suck, you can't do that. So what are the negative thoughts that are coming up in your mind? And just trying to catch it. Number two is whatever you want to have more of, you need to create that in your life. You need to create the habits and routines to have more of it in your life. So for me, I want more belief, right? And I go through this whole process of how to figure out your most important core value or your one word. You can pick up your one word or Built to Serve. It'll walk you through it. What do you need more of in your life? I need more belief. And as much as I'm trying to spread that to the world with the videos and everything I make, I also need more of it myself. I need more belief for myself. And so what helps me believe in myself? Well, I try to design a life and an environment to help bring that out more. So everything from the outfit that I wear, I tell myself I'm a superhero going to work. This is my believe uniform, just like Batman puts on his costume. From what my office looks like and the pictures on my wall, I've got my parents on my wall, and looking at them reminds me of the message that my mom would always give me, that I'm Advocate Shirley Carmichael, I can do anything and believe that I can. The videos that I make, the main channel, the top 10 channel, this channel, all the content that I make is designed to help me believe in myself more. That's what helps me come alive. Service, thinking about how what I'm going to do will have an impact on somebody else besides me, helps me have the courage to go off and chase down the goals that I have for myself. So what is it that makes you come alive? What do you need more of it in your life? Because you're probably not getting enough of it, right? The thing that you need more in your life, you're not getting enough of it right now. That's why that negative voice is so powerful and default. So think about the people who you're hanging around and the media you're consuming, all of it. You're not getting enough of the thing that you need. So how do you get more of that thing and engineer it, design it so that it's part of your daily calendar, that's not randomly happening in your life, but it's with intent, must happen every day. So number one is catching that voice. What is that voice? Number two is designing that environment and the habits and the routines for yourself so that you're around it constantly. You're changing our environment to be around the thing that you know that you want to be. And then number three is empower people to pull you out of the matrix. Empower people to call you out. Empower people to give you feedback. Some of my favorite ways to do it, whenever I'm going to an event or whenever I'm talking to somebody I respect and I need some help, input, guidance, feedback, I'll say, tell me why I suck. Tell me why I suck at this thing. Why do I suck at this? How do I get better? And when I do that, it's because they give me their honest feedback. When you just ask for feedback, people will be afraid of hurting your feelings and you won't get the full info. So I say, tell me why I suck. And they say, well, you don't suck, but here's what you need to fix. I empower the people around me that if I say scary, difficult, or hard, then I have to go off and do the thing just because I said scary, difficult, or hard. I don't want to be the person who plays small. So my son in particular loves this one, right? It's like, Dad, you did it. You said scary. Shoot, okay. Now I have to go off and do it. What are your trigger words? What are the things that make you stay small? And then empower the people around you to call you out on it. So that when you don't catch it, because you won't catch it most of the time, you won't catch it. But when you can't catch it and somebody else can, not being defensive and not putting our guard up, and realizing that, hey, this behavior is keeping me stuck. Empowering the people around you to give you the feedback, to pull you out of the matrix, so you can start turning what's subconscious to conscious. If you feel like you're a little bit stuck, if you feel like you want to do more and you're capable of more and you want to serve more and help more, and you know that you've got this voice inside you that's keeping you there, and you're struggling with how do I get it from subconscious and automatic negative to subconscious and automatic positive, everything starts to change. You have to treat yourself like you matter. Just imagine that you were actually your own best friend. Just imagine that you came to you with the problems that you're facing. What would you tell yourself? It's probably going to be something loving, something encouraging, something powerful, something positive, not the words that you're actually using to talk to yourself. This doesn't change in a day, It doesn't change in an instant. It's a process. But if every day, day by day, you can slowly start to believe in yourself more, empower yourself more, talk to yourself in a better way, you're going to create a much better life for yourself, and then you can pay it forward and help others. Because no matter what words you say, no matter how much you tell people to be positive, again, you're here watching this, you are the most positive person in your family, you're pouring into other people. No matter how much words you use, what they'll be inspired by most is your action. No matter how much you say, hey, love yourself, make this happen, I believe in you, if they see you not believing in yourself, not taking the action you need to take, they'll never be inspired to do it themselves either. They'll be most inspired by the actions that you take when you're afraid and you doubt yourself too. It's time to make a change. Let's make that change today.
Also, to make sure you're actually taking action after watching this video, I've designed a special free worksheet just for this video. The worksheet will highlight all of the lessons learned in this video, as well as pull out our 3 favorite learnings and quotes that will inspire you to actually do something. The worksheet will also give you space to write down what your key takeaways are and your specific plan of action to make sure you're getting results. If you want the worksheet designed specifically for this video, absolutely for free, there's a link in the description below. Go click on it and start building the momentum in your life and your business. I'll see you there.
Lecture is a form of theater. Now, it's a serious form of theater, but theater can be serious, and there's because partly what I'm doing is I'm presenting ideas to an audience, but I'm also modeling the act of engaging with ideas. And that's the theatrical end of it. And I don't give the same talk twice. Like, I have my stories and I have my collection of things I know and I talk about, but I try to do 2 things. I'm always talking to specific individuals in the audience. And so I'm having a conversation with the audience. And so that's part of the dynamic element of the performance. And the other thing I'm trying to do is to further my thinking on the topics that I'm addressing. And there is a theatrical element to that, because it's like, I think the closest thing really that it compares to is probably stand-up comedy. Although I think the routines that comedians have are probably more well and formally practiced than the ones than the talks that I engage in. And I don't really think of it as delivering a lecture to an audience. I'm trying to think about complicated things in real time with an audience there to participate and to use the audience as an indicator of whether what I'm saying is gripping and comprehensible. Silicon Valley tends to be liberal. Everyone knows that. And the reason for that is that there's a tremendous number of entrepreneurs there. And entrepreneurs tend to be high in openness and lower in conscientiousness. So they're creative, but they're also willing to break rules, which you kind of have to do often. Hopefully not to a criminal extent, but you have to. It's tricky when you're trying to establish something new, because look at a company like Uber, they had to bend the rules to be successful. And those companies that have rented those scooters out and put them on the streets everywhere, they just kind of went ahead and did it. It's not something an orderly person would do, because they'd ask for permission, whereas the people who started these scooter rental companies just said, well, what'll happen if we put them everywhere? And the answer was, that seemed to work. But, you have to have a rule-breaking proclivity in order to manage that. Take a bit of a look at yourself and think about what's not so good that you could improve, that you should improve by your own standards, and that you would improve, and set yourself a little goal. Maybe you're not studying at all and you're at university. Or maybe you're at work and you've got this stack of paper there, and you haven't looked at that damn stack for like a month, and you know that you should be, and you're bothering yourself at night because you're avoiding that. It's like, maybe think, well, I've avoided that stack of paper completely for 1 month. I'm quite a coward when it comes to whatever snakes might be hidden in that stack of paper. How about tomorrow I just put that stack of paper in front of me on my desk, and I glance through it for 15 seconds. See if I can do that. It's like, well, you set yourself a goal of improvement. It's a humble goal, because really, are you such a coward that the best that you can bloody well manage after a month of avoidance is 15 seconds of exposure to a stack of paper? It could easily be. You've been avoiding it. So you're obviously afraid of it. And so the situation could be that dismal and dire. And you might think, well, geez, it's no balm to my ego. It's not fostering the strength of my ego to recognize in myself someone who could only withstand 15 seconds of exposure to that thing I'm afraid of. And so that's a form of humility too. It's like, there's things you could do to improve, and you know what they are. And there's small steps that you could take, that you might take, that would put you in that direction. And then the question is, are you big enough to take those small steps? Are you capable of grappling with the fact that you're fundamentally flawed to the point where you have to break things down into almost childlike steps in order to manage them? And the answer to that is, yeah, you are. And that's the lot of, I don't know if it's the lot of everyone. Most people have things they avoid, and they're afraid of. So I would say to some degree, it's the lot of everyone. People vary in the degree to which they've conquered that. And you do meet people from time to time who are extraordinarily disciplined. But most of the time, they've got disciplined in exactly this manner. It's through slow incremental improvement. And then you challenge yourself. It's like, well, could I do this? That would be better. Then you find out. And then you think, well, is there something slightly larger and more challenging that I could do? That would be better. And you try it and you find out. And as you try it and you find out, generally you get better at it and you can take on larger and larger challenges. In any case, people do waste a lot of time, and they also act counterproductively a lot of the time. Regardless, we do make progress, and we can thrive under the difficult conditions that make up our lives, and we can resist the malevolence that entices us. That's within our power, and we don't know the limits to that. And we also know that it's better to, we all know this, that it's better to live courageously than cowardly. Everyone knows that. That's what you teach people that you love. And we know that it's better to live truthfully than in deceit. And you can tell that too, because that's also what you tell people that you love. And we know that you should pick up your damn responsibility and move forward. Everyone knows that. It's part of our intrinsic moral nature. And that nature is there. And it's not difficult to communicate to people about this. Like, everyone knows that you wake up at 3 in the morning when you've let your life go off the rails, and that you berate yourself for your uselessness and your cruelty and your failure to take the opportunities that are in front of you. And if you were the master in your own house, in some sense, the captain of your own destiny, if there was no intrinsic nature, well, that would never happen. You'd just let yourself off the hook. There'd be no voice of conscience tormenting you. But no one escapes from that. And what that indicates, to me, is that, at least psychologically, we live in a universe that's characterized by a moral dimension, and we understand that well, and that moral failings have consequences, and that they're not trivial. They destroy you. They destroy your family. They destroy your community. And you can tell people that. And they listen because they know. They don't know they know. That's the thing. And maybe that's the thing about being an intellectual. You have the opportunity to articulate ideas that other people know, they embody, but they can't articulate. And that's what people tell me. They say, well, you help me give words to things that I always knew to be true but couldn't say. Or they say, I've been trying to put some of your precepts into practice. Responsibility being a main one, vision another, honesty, I suppose, bringing up the pack and saying, and this is the fun part of doing all of this. Fun is a weak word. That it's the remarkable part of doing all this. I mean, I have people tell me constantly wherever I go. It's so delightful that they were in a pretty dark place, and they tell me why. And there's plenty of dark places in the world. And they decided, well, maybe they were going to develop a bit of a vision and take a bit more responsibility. If you really want to solve a complicated problem, maybe you try to solve it 100 ways, and then you take the best solution.
Got it.
And look, this happens to entrepreneurs all the time too. Like most entrepreneurs, this is something to know, well, most creative people fail at producing their creative product and monetizing it, right? So your default position, if you're a creative person, is you're going to fail. And that's because it's hard to come up with something new, and it's hard to present it to the market at the right time. and it's hard to market it. Like those things are really, really difficult. And so what successful entrepreneurs do is they just keep doing it over and over and over and over and over and over and over. And eventually, if they're fortunate, one of their ideas happens to hit the right place at the right time. And so that's also Darwinian in some sense. You know, you're creating all these little enterprises that are sort of alive. They're run by people after all. And even if your idea is good, that doesn't mean it will be successful. There's so many things that have to be taken into account. So this is partly why persistence, and that's part of conscientiousness, is so useful. It's like, you know, what do they say? If at first you fail, then try again. And that would probably mean try something different rather than the same thing. But persistence is helpful because it enables you to run many, many experiments. And you need to know that the baseline is failure. You know, it's important because otherwise you'll blame that on yourself. I would say for the last 45 years, we've told psychologists have been certainly to blame for this, at least in part. You're okay the way you are. That's what we tell young people. Oh, you're okay the way you are. It's like, and there's nothing worse than you can tell someone who's young than that, especially if they're miserable. You know, and lots of them, well, if they're miserable and aimless, it's like, oh, I'm miserable and aimless, and sometimes I'm suicidal and I'm nihilistic and I don't have any direction in your life. In my life. It's like, well, you're okay the way you are. And it's like, they don't want to hear that. They want to hear, look, you know, and you know this, you're useless. You know nothing. You haven't got started. You've got 60 years to put yourself together, and God only knows what you could become. And that message is so much more, it's so funny because it's such an attack, but it's so positive because there's faith there in the potential that makes up the person rather than the miserable actuality that happens to be manifesting itself at the moment. And young people respond extraordinarily well to that because, and you know that if you're a parent and you love your child, your son, your daughter, what you're trying to foster is the best in them. You want that to manifest itself across the course of their life. You want them to become continually more than they are, to see what they could be. And I think that's part of the great message of the West, is that that's the ethical requirement of individual being in the proper sense, is to constantly note that you're not what you could be, to take responsibility for that, and to commit yourself, like body and soul, to the attainment of that ideal. The first thing I think you need to understand is that these people that you're comparing yourself to, you don't really know very well. You know, and what that means is that you see their shiny outside, but you don't see the reality of their life. And so what you're... You know, maybe you're in California, see someone speeding down the road in a convertible Porsche, and you think, oh man, what a lucky bastard. And the truth of the matter is that he's thinking about wrapping his expensive sports car around the next cement pillar that he comes close to. You know, you can't tell, and people have hard lives, and even people who are comparatively fortunate have hard lives. And so the ideal that you're observing that makes you jealous and resentful is in large part an illusion that's created by your own mind. And you know, I can give you just one example. Is like, I know a fair number of extremely wealthy people, and most of the people I happen to know are people who've made their money themselves. And I tell you, man, they have a burden of responsibility that would crush me, would crush the typical person. They're just working flat out, like 90 hours a week, and they have thousands of people depending on them. And you know, they have their money, and they have their status, and that's not nothing. But don't be thinking that there isn't a price to be paid for that. You know, they don't see their families, they're often divorced, they don't see their children grow up, and and they don't have time off. Now, there are wealthy, what would you call, playboy types, I suppose, who live out the dreams of wealth of a foolish 14-year-old, but they're not that common, and you have to be careful of what you're jealous of because you don't really know what it is. And then the other thing that's kind of useful is to understand that you're different from everyone else. And this is especially true as you get older. When you're 17 or 16 or something like that, comparing yourself to other people makes a certain amount of sense because 16 and 17-year-olds, they're kind of the same, you know, which is why when you go off to university, you can make friends so quickly. It's like, I'm just about 60. It takes me like 15 years to make a friend now, you know, as opposed to the 2 months that it took when I was 17. You're quite different from other people, and you shouldn't be comparing yourself to them because they're not like you. You know, they don't have your family. They don't have your temperament. They don't have your troubles. They don't have your abilities. The only person that the only person that has those is you. And this is why one of the rules, I think it's rule 4, is compare yourself to who you were yesterday and not to who someone else is today. And see, that's a game you can win because you could be a little better today than you were yesterday. And that's a good thing. You're a little better. That's a good thing. And you know, no doubt there are some things that you could improve. You know, if you sit and meditate for any length of time about what you're not doing optimally, answers will spring to mind. You have to be humble and wise enough to understand that you might have to aim pretty damn low, especially in those places where you're not functioning well. And it might be so embarrassing that you can't bring yourself to fathom that that's actually who you are. But, you know, Jung described the fool, the archetypal figure of the trickster and the fool, as the precursor to the savior, to the redeemer. And that's an unbelievable bit of wisdom because what Jung meant was that to put yourself together, which is to follow the path of redemption, to follow the redeemer. If the redeemer is a type of personality that you could in fact be inhabited by or manifest, then the first steps towards that is to allow yourself to be a fool, right? It's because you don't know what you're doing. You have to admit that. And there's going to be a loss of ego or destruction of ego, arrogant ego that necessarily accompanies that. But you need the loss of that arrogant ego because it's precisely what's interfering with your movement forward. You know, it's part of the adversarial process, mythologically speaking, that stops moral progress. You're too proud of who you think you are to notice what you're like so that you could change properly. You don't want to sacrifice that part of yourself. It's probably associated with some delusion that helps you maintain, what would you say, a positive, although very fragile self-image, you know, in the absence of genuine effort. You can look at that pessimism that constitutes, let's say, the core of what, well, I think it's the core religious message, really, is the tragic nature of the world, the reality of suffering. It's part of the core religious message. But what emerges out of that, properly conceptualized, is a remarkable appreciation for what human beings are capable of. Like, we are unbelievably resilient and able creatures, and we do not have any conception of our upper limits. You'll discover a little bit more about your potential as you discover who you are, especially the darker parts of yourself, because then you discover your potential for mayhem. There's some real utility in that. You know, a discovery that you're dangerous. It's such a useful discovery. It's actually something that strengthens you, because the first thing that a realization like that can, in fact, produce is the ambition to incorporate that danger into a higher order personality, that dangerousness into a higher order personality. And that can make you implacable. That can make you someone who can say no when you need to say no. That can make you someone who won't avoid necessary conflict. And so that's unbelievably useful. When you're moving through life and you have a plan or a dream and it shatters, someone dies or a relationship breaks apart, or you have a terrible upset in your career, or you become ill in some unexpected way, then everything around you falls apart and you plunge into a chaotic underworld.
The belly of the whale.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yes, exactly that. And then maybe you stay there, because it isn't necessarily the case that people get out. People die. People are in despair permanently. But frequently, something tragic and terrible befalls you, and you fall apart, and you learn something profound as a consequence, and you put yourself back together. And when you come back out, you're more than you were when you went in. And that's happening at a small scale. Every time you learn something, if you ever really learn something, it's usually painful. It usually means that you have to recognize that you're wrong in some important way. You have to let that part of you that's wrong die. And then you have to let a new part of you. Okay, so the self, imagine that you undergo a series of transformations in your life. There are collapses into the chaotic underworld, and then mini resurrections. That happens continually. Tell your kid, here's an impossible thing. Why don't you go out and fail? You say, here's something worth going after. Here's a step you could take that would push you beyond where you are, but that you also have a reasonably high probability of succeeding at. Right? They call that
within a time frame.
Within some time frame. That's the other thing. You have to parameterize it with regards to time frame. That's right. And that puts you in the zone of proximal development. And that's a concept that was generated by a guy named Vygotsky. He was a Russian developmental psychologist, and a smart one. It's where the idea of the zone comes from, to be in the zone. Yes. And when you're in the zone, you're expanding your skills in a manner that's intrinsically rewarding, because you're succeeding. And so you want to set, if you're good to yourself, you think, okay, I need to set a goal, but I need to set a goal that someone as stupid and useless as me could probably attain if they put some effort into it.
Right.
And then you've got it perfectly, because it's not so high that it's grandiose or impossible that you fail necessarily and then justify your bitterness. It's like, well, I could do well, because that happens to people.
Happens all the time.
Yeah, it's like,
see this all the time.
It's like, yes, exactly. Well, I set a goal and I didn't attain it, so I'm not going to set any more goals.
Right.
It's like, no, you set a goal that was inappropriate
for the time frame.
Yeah. That's right. You didn't calibrate it properly, and you're playing a trick on yourself because you wanted to fail so that you could justify not having to try.
And being a victim,
which isn't helpful. You're still going to be a victim. It's like, there's no way out of that, man. Yeah. So, because life is a challenge that in some sense can't be surmounted. So there's no way out of your problem. You have to move from point A to B in life, but point A is often a very difficult place to be, because we're fragile and bounded and mortal and limited, and because we know that. And so one of the implications of that, as many great religious traditions are at pains to illustrate or demonstrate or proclaim, is that life is essentially suffering. And I believe that to be a fundamental truth. But perhaps not the most fundamental truth, because I think the most fundamental truth is that despite the fact that life is suffering, people can transcend that. And partly the way they transcend that is by pursuing things of value. And so that if there is no value proposition at hand, then you have no meaning to justify the difficult conditions of your life. And that's brutally difficult for people. Nietzsche said, he who has a why can bear any how. And you see, and I've certainly seen this as a clinical practitioner, that people who have no purpose in their life are embittered by the difficulties of their life. And they become first bitter, and then resentful, and then revengeful, and then cruel. And there's plenty of places to go past cruel. That's just where you start if you're really on a downhill path. We didn't understand that truth comes in different forms depending on its application. It's a tricky thing. There's the truths that apply when you're attempting to describe the transformations of the material world. And there's the truths that apply when you're trying to determine how it is that you should act while you're alive. And those have to come into alignment, but they're not in alignment right now. And my sense, and this is a sense that's been developed, at least in part from reading the great psychoanalysts, is that fictional accounts, metafictional accounts, even like biblical accounts, which are mythological, are stories about how it is that people should act, not stories about what the material structure of the world is. The more radical the necessary change, the more pain that accompanies it. Like the more opportunity as well. And a lot of what we learn painfully. And so it's not surprising that people shrink away from learning. We learn in pain and anxiety very frequently. Everyone knows that. Like the things that you really learned in life, it's like, it was no joy, man. Like it took you out. And so the fact that people flee from that is hardly surprising. But it doesn't help, that's the thing. It just stores up the catastrophe for later. And so the better idea is to eat a little poison every day so that you don't have to overdose in a month. It's something like that. And it is the case that I think because you aren't forced to, first of all, you don't learn unless you're forced to learn. I know there's alternatives to that. There's the voluntary search for knowledge, and that's a fine thing, and that is an antidote to this. But apart from that, speaking more practically, you tend not to learn unless you're forced to learn, and what you tend to learn by force are difficult lessons. And so people are very prone to not seek that out. It's not surprising, but it's because they don't understand the consequences very well. It's because they're convinced that there's some way of forestalling the necessary learning, and there isn't any way of forestalling it. All you do is make it worse in the future. You make yourself smaller, and you make the lesson harder. And so that's why in so many religious doctrines there's emphasis on humility. And humility isn't to debase yourself. It's to understand that you don't know enough so that your life isn't going to be miserable. And so every chance you get to grab something new that will help you along your way, you should take it as fast as you can. But you have to have a very tragic, I would say, view of reality, and also a harsh one, because it's not just tragedy, it's also malevolence. You have to understand that those are waiting for you, and that makes you desperate enough to learn, and that might make you desperate enough to fall out of your ideology. But that's a hard way of looking at the world. It beats living through it, though. One of the things I've been talking to my audiences about is the relationship between responsibility and meaning, which is, what would you say? It's a constant refrain in the book. It's one of its underlying messages, let's say, or themes is a better way of thinking about it. If you start with the presumption that there's a baseline of suffering in life, and that can be exaggerated as a consequence of human failing, as a consequence of malevolence and betrayal and self-betrayal and deceit and all those things that we do to each other and ourselves that we know that aren't good, that amplifies the suffering. That's sort of the baseline against which you have to work. And it's contemplation of that often that makes people hopeless and depressed and anxious and overwhelmed and all of that. And they have the reasons. But you need something to put up against that. And what you put up against that is meaning. Meaning is actually the instinct that helps you guide yourself through that catastrophe. And most of that meaning is to be found in the adoption of responsibility. So if you think, for example, about the people that you admire, well, you think about when you have a clear conscience first, because that's a good thing to aim at, which is something different than happiness, right?
A clear conscience is different than happiness.
Yeah, it's better.
Yeah.
That's
you're not
better.
Guilting yourself. You're not feeling bad about yourself.
That's right. You feel that you've justified your existence, right? And so you're not waking up at 3 a.m. in a cold sweat thinking about all the terrible things that you've involved yourself in.
What you said to someone that you shouldn't have said, or how you acted, or lied,
what
or
opportunity you lost, or the things that you've let go that you should have capitalized on, and all of that. And so, if you think about the times when you're at peace with yourself with regards to how you're conducting yourself in the world, it's almost always conditions under which you've adopted responsibility, right? At least the most guilt I think that you can experience perhaps is the sure knowledge that you're not even taking care of yourself, so that you're leaving that responsibility to other people, because that's pretty pathetic. And unless you're psychopathic, and and you're living a parasitical life, and that characterizes a very small minority of people, and an even smaller minority think that's justifiable. But most of the time you're in guilt and shame because not only are you not taking care of yourself, let's say, so someone else has to, but you're not living up to your full potential. And so there's an existential weight that goes along with that. We kind of have this idea that, well, you're free as a child, and then let me see if I can put this properly, that you have a certain delightful, wonderful, positive freedom as a child, and then that's given up as you approach adulthood. But the truth of the matter is that you have a lot of potential as a child, but none of that is capable of manifesting itself as freedom before you become disciplined. And discipline is a matter of the imposition of order, and the order is necessary, especially for people who are hopeless and nihilistic. And lots of people are hopeless and nihilistic, way more people than you think. And part of that is because no one's ever really encouraged them. And so the book is in part a matter of encouragement. It's like, lay a disciplinary structure on yourself, get the chaos in check, and then you can move towards a state that's freer, because it's discipline first. Like, look, if you're going to become a concert pianist, there's going to be several thousand hours of extraordinarily disciplined practice. That's the imposition of order on your potential, let's say. But what comes out of that is a much grander freedom. Your best bet is truth. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's always going to do the trick. Right? I mean, sometimes you go fight a dragon and it eats you. And if you being eaten wasn't a real possibility, it wouldn't be a real fight. And so you see people, like I've seen people in my clinical practice sometimes. I had one client in particular who was undergoing a particularly vicious divorce with someone who was really seriously inclined to take him out and would do pretty much everything at her disposal to do so. And I strategized with him for about 3 years. And we did everything, and hyper carefully. He was a very conscientious and diligent person, and he put into practice everything that we discussed and strategized, and he still he got backed into a corner so hard that I didn't know how to help him anymore. So I would say, however, that he was a very truthful person throughout that, and one thing he did do was, part of it was a custody battle, and he did manage, despite his decline, in consequence of being repeatedly cornered, I would say, he did manage to establish what I think was a lasting relationship with his kids. So he might have got enough out of what he did to justify it, even though the whole landscape was pretty awful. I think that not lying is your best bet, but life is hard and people get run over, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to emerge in any obvious sense triumphant. But if you take the alternative path, especially when you're facing severe tribulations, let's say, and you complicate those with deceit, you can be sure that whatever tragedy that you're confronting is going to turn into not only tragedy, but something very much akin to hell. And so you might be able to at least minimize the degree of suffering, even if you can't overcome it or transcend it. People came to my website because they were interested in, well, before the political stuff blew up, I had 1 million views on YouTube, which isn't nothing. 1 million of anything is a lot. But then when the political scandal started to break, then people came for them but stayed for the content, and that's been really useful. Well, it's been, and it's not that surprising. Well, because of what you do, it's like there's a great hunger for information that is practical and useful and that helps people find meaning in their lives and orient themselves. There's a great hunger for that, and most of my lectures were derived from solid psychology, some of it experimental, some of it biological, some of it from the domains of neuroscience, a lot of it from great clinicians. It's not surprising that people find it helpful because, great clinicians were great because they were really helpful. And so to distill that and to offer it to people in a digestible form, to have that have a good effect on them, well, that's what you'd expect. That's what the whole discipline is about. And so that's been great. This circumambulation that Jung talked about was this continual we'll return to this continual circling in some sense of who you could be. You might notice, for example, that there are themes in your life. You know, when you go back across your experiences, you see you kind of have your typical experience that sort of repeats itself. And there might be variation on it, like a musical theme, but it's like you're circling yourself and getting closer to yourself as you move across time. That's the circumambulation. Now, you remember that for a sec, because we'll go back to it. Okay, so imagine that something glimmers before you. It's an interest that's dawning, and you decide, well, first of all, you're paralyzed. You think, well, how do I know if I should pursue that? It's probably a stupid idea. And the proper response to that is, you're right, it probably is a stupid idea, because almost all ideas are stupid. And so the probability that as you move forward on your adventure that you're going to get it right the first time is zero. It's just not going to happen. And so then you might think, well, maybe I'll just wait around until I get the right idea, and which people do, right? So they're like 40-year-old, 13-year-olds, which is not a good idea. And so they wait around until it's waiting for Godot, until they finally got it right. But the problem is you're too stupid to know when you've got it right. So waiting around isn't going to help, because even if the perfect opportunity manifested itself to you in your incomplete form, the probability that you would recognize it as the perfect opportunity is zero. You might even think it's the worst possible idea that you've ever heard of anywhere. Highly likely, highly likely. So you have, Nietzsche called that a will to stupidity, which I really liked. So, because he thought of stupidity as being you have to take it into account fundamentally and work with it. And so you can take these tentative steps on your pathway to destiny, and you can assume that you're going to do it badly. And that's really useful, because you don't have to beat yourself up. It's pretty easy to do it badly. But the thing is, it's way better to do it badly than not to do it at all. You start your path and you think that you're heading, towards your star. And so you go in that direction. And then, because you're here, the world looks a particular way, but then when you move here, the world looks different, and you're different as a consequence of having made that voyage. And so what that means is that now that thing that glimmers in front of you is going to have shifted its location, because you weren't very good at specifying it to begin with, and now that you're a little sharper and more focused than you were, it's going to reveal itself with more accuracy to you. And so then you have to take it's almost like a 180-degree reversal. But it isn't, because, you've gone this far, and that's a long ways to get that far. But that's a lot farther than you would be if you just stayed where you were, waiting. And so it doesn't matter that you overshoot continually, because as you overshoot, even if you don't learn what you should have done, you're going to continually learn what you shouldn't keep doing. And if you learn enough about what you shouldn't keep doing, then that's tantamount at some point to learning at the same time what you should be doing. So it's okay. So it's like this. Now, what's cool about it, though, I think, is that as you progress, the degree of overshooting starts to decline. The fact that you're full of faults doesn't mean you have to stop. And thank God for that. That's a really useful thing. And the fact that you're full of faults doesn't mean that you can't learn. And so you can posit an ideal, and you're going to be wrong about it, but it doesn't matter, because what you're right about is positing the ideal and moving towards it. If the actual ideal isn't conceptualized perfectly, well, first, surprise, surprise, because what are you going to do that's perfect? So it doesn't matter that it's imperfect. It just matters that you do it and that you move forward. So that's really positive news as far as I'm concerned, because you can actually do that, right? You can do it badly. Anyone can do that. So that's useful.
You're one of the best communicators that I've ever listened to. If I could be half as good at at communicating as you are, I would be set. How can I teach myself to do that?
Practice. Really, there's a couple of things. It helps to read a lot. It really helps to write. So if you want to make yourself articulate, which is a very good idea, then not only should you read, but you should write down what you think. And if you can do that a little bit every day, 15 minutes, maybe you could steal 15 minutes and do it every day. But if you do that for 10 years, you really straighten out your thinking. If you're going to speak effectively, you have to know way more than you're talking about, you know. So this is often difficult for beginning lecturers at university, because they'll do a lecture on a topic, but they only know as much as they're saying in the lecture. And they get kind of stuck to their notes because of it. But you want to know 10 times as much as you are saying in the lecture, and then you can specify a stepping path through it and elaborate with the other things that you know. But to do that, you have to do a lot of reading. But you also have to do a lot of reading, because that's where the synthesizing comes. So that's on the input side. And then on the output side, well, there's some techniques, let's say, is like if you're speaking in front of a group, you are not delivering a talk to a group. That's not what you're doing. The talk isn't a packaged thing that you present to a group. There isn't a group. There's a bunch of individuals, and you talk to them. So when I talk to a group, I always talk to people one at a time. And that makes it easier too, because you know how to talk to a person. It's like, can you talk to 1,000 people? Well, probably not, because it's too intimidating. But there isn't 1,000 people there. There's 1,000 individuals. And so you just look at an individual and you say something, and you can tell if they're engaged. They look confused, or they look interested, or they look angry, or they look bored, or maybe they're asleep, in which case you look at someone else. And they give you feedback about how you're doing. And so one thing is to have something to say, yeah, but the next thing is pay attention to who you're talking to. Because unless you're very badly socialized, and that seems unlikely in your case, because you present yourself at least moderately well, and well, I mean, I don't know you very well, but on first sight, you're doing fine. So the probability that if you pay attention to the individuals that you're talking to, that your natural wealth of social skill will manifest itself is extremely high. And so you don't deliver a talk to an audience. That's a really bad way of thinking about it. You're actually engaged in a conversation with an audience. Even if they're not talking, they're nodding and shifting position and looking like this, and you can pull all that in and use it to govern the level at which you're addressing the entire audience. So the last thing I would say is, well, having the aim to be a good communicator is a good start. And you think, well, I could buttress that to some degree. Well, there isn't anything that you can possibly, this is the whole point of a liberal education, there isn't anything that you can possibly do that makes you more competent in everything you do than to learn how to communicate. I don't care if you're going to be a carpenter. I mean, being a carpenter, by the way, is very difficult, especially if you're a good carpenter. But if you're good at communicating as a carpenter, you're like 10 times better as a carpenter. So, and this is something that the liberal arts colleges, I think, I don't know if they've forgotten it, but they don't do a very good job of marketing. It's like, well, what's the use of a bachelor's degree, a Bachelor of Arts? It's like, well, you can think, you can write, you can speak, you've read something. It's like, the economic value of that is incalculable. The people that I've watched in my life who've been spectacularly successful they have skills. Clearly, that's a minimum precondition. But they're also very, very good at articulating themselves. And so whenever they negotiate, they're successful. Well, that's kind of like the definition of success in life, right? You negotiate and it doesn't mean you win. Because if you're a good negotiator, if you're a really good negotiator, everybody walks away from the negotiation thrilled. And so then people line up to do things with you. So, and that's all dependent on your ability to communicate. So, practice. There is definitely an epidemic of overprotective parenting. But it's useful to ask why. And my suspicions is that this is driven by very fundamental biological and cultural phenomena that aren't generally considered in relationship to this issue. We don't have very many children. We don't have 12, 6 of whom die. We have 1 or 2, and that makes them very precious right? We're unwilling to take risks with them, and no wonder. And then we also have them much later in life. And so, like, if you have a kid when you're 18, you're still a kid. You know, you're going to go out and have your life, right? Because you're so, well, you're in the height of your exploratory, you're in the height of the exploratory part of your life. You're not going to overprotect your kid because you're still a kid. But if you're 40 and you have one child, it's like all your eggs are in one basket. And the probability that you're going to take undue risks with that precious person is very, very low. Now, obviously, there's some advantages to that because, great, you devote resources to your child, you know, and foster their development. But the downside is that you have every motivation to hover. And maybe you're also extraordinarily desperate as a mother to maintain that bond with your child because you've struggled so long to achieve it. It's highly, highly valuable. You can't take a risk. Well, so we might say, well, perhaps overprotective parenting is a secondary and unintended consequence of the birth control pill and the fact that people now have children later in life. Could easily be. You know, if you have 6 kids, it's like, what are you going to do? Helicopter parent them? It's like, no, you're so tired you can't even get off the couch if you have 6 kids. And they outnumber you, right? They're raising each other. They're competing and they're taking each other down a peg. There's no overprotection there. But with a single child landscape or dual child landscape, mostly a single child landscape, then you're going to overprotect. And then that ethos starts to permeate the schools and it starts to permeate the higher education institutions as those children mature. And then that all reinforces it. It's not good. It's not obvious what to do about it either, because if it is driven by demographics in that sense, it's a much more intractable problem than we think. So I did some of that in 12 Rules for Life. You know, I said, look, what you have to understand is that you're a danger to your children no matter what, right? You can let them go out in the world and be hurt, or you can overprotect them and hurt them that way. So here's your choice. You can make your children competent and courageous, or you can make them safe. But you can't make them safe because life isn't safe. So if you sacrifice their courage and competence on the altar of safety, then you disarm them completely. And all they can do is pray to be protected. You're going to use what you think to guide your action, and the consequence of that is going to be how your life turns out. So I'm dead serious about what I write because I know what the pathway is. It's like you don't communicate in a false manner, because if you do, you will warp the structure that guides your actions, and you will absolutely 100% suffer for that. I mean, one of the things I've learned as a clinical psychologist is that I've never seen anyone, it's really a terrifying thing, I've never seen anyone get away with anything, ever. The chickens always come home to roost. So, and sometimes it might, you know, let's say you get away with something, it's like, yeah, you think so, man. You wait 5 years from now, 7 years from now, it'll come back.
Is that karma?
It's more like, yes, I think it's the same idea, but it's more like you don't have the power to manipulate reality. Like, you have the power to bring about reality in some sense, because you confront potential, and through your actions and your communicative intent, you turn potential into reality. But you don't have the power to bend reality without it snapping back at you.
You don't think so? So you don't think visionaries and influencers have the ability to bend reality?
No, I don't think they bend it. I think that they I mean, you can bring new things into being, but you can't get away with a falsehood. No, you can definitely bring new things into being.
You can't get away with a falsehood.
Yes, that's it. And
maybe, okay, makes sense.
And you can't get away with weak thinking either, because, I mean, any more than you can get away with improper action. It just doesn't work. So you're contending, it's why, I mean, one of the themes in my writing is the danger of falsehood. And at every level, it's like, well, if you tell the truth to the degree that you can, or at least don't lie, I think that's rule 8, then you have reality on your side. You got to decide, man. You want reality on your side, or do you want reality against you? Now, I wouldn't recommend the whole reality against you thing, because you're not going to win. You're going to get flattened. And so I'm very careful with what I say, and I'm very careful with what I write. We are thrown challenges, and that in some sense those are best construed as tests of our ethical ability. So what Jung thought, his idea was something like this, that at the beginning of time, people were unconscious, and that consciousness emerged with all of its catastrophes, consciousness of death, for example. And one way out of the burden of consciousness was to return to unconsciousness. You can do that with alcohol. You can do that by being dependent. You can do that by failing to grow up. You refuse the burden of consciousness by becoming unconscious again. But there's another way forward, which is to become even more conscious. So the idea would be a little bit of consciousness is like an illness. But if you can expand that consciousness upwards enough, then it's something, it starts to become something that is its own cure. You know, because it's one thing to live properly, and that's not a trivial thing, but it's another thing to be able to articulate yourself and to be able to negotiate. And generally speaking, there's nothing about that that isn't advantageous. And even introverted and anxious people can learn to do that. You know, those are learnable skills. It's not easy, but you can manage it. You can also speak carefully, you know, and listen to what you're saying and only try to say things that you think are true. That's also unbelievably useful. You have to feel that out. Like, is this really what I believe? Or am I putting it forward, well, because I want to look good, or I want to dominate, or I want to express obliquely an emotion that I'm too cowardly to come out and confront directly, or am I being manipulative? There's lots of reasons that people use language. But what you really should use it for is to state what you believe to be true, and then to let the consequences of that unfold. And so that can also help you. Simple truths, bluntly stated, can be very powerful. You don't need a lot of verbal fluency under those circumstances if there's evidence of strength of character behind it. It's good for you to go take your place in the world. Have some ambition. Have a vision, have a goal, have a strategy. Try to be a good person, not because it's your duty precisely, because that's the proper way to live. We're in danger of undermining all of that, and it's not good for people. One of the things that I've really learned, for example, recently is that learned to articulate better, is that there's a very tight relationship between aspiration and responsibility. So let's say, well, the first question might be, do you need to aspire to something? And the answer is, well, yes, because you have to do something. If you just sit there, you'll die. You can't just sit there. You have to go act out in the world. Okay, so act towards what? Well, that's whatever your aspiration is. You have to have an aim. Okay, well, what should the aim be? Well, it should be something worth doing, let's say. Why do something that you don't feel is worth doing? What do you think's worth doing? Well, if you watch other people and you judge when they're doing something worthwhile, you usually judge them positively if you see that they're taking responsibility, at least for themselves. What, do you want to be completely useless so other people have to take care of you? That's pretty pathetic. And maybe you could get your act together so you're taking care of yourself and your family. And maybe you could even do better than that and take care of yourself and your family and your community. There's lots of ways of defying the crowd, let's say. I mean, you could live your life the way that you want to live it. That's a matter of action. You know, and they say actions speak louder than words. And one of the best things you could possibly be is an inspirational example. So that's not nothing. That's something. Live properly in your defiance of the crowd, right? Make your own course. Allow yourself to be guided by your own genuine principles. You don't necessarily have to advertise that, which is in some sense what you're doing when you're debating, because you're taking the manner in which you act, like if you're an integrated person and you're articulating that. But maybe you can't do that because you don't have the verbal skills. Well, then the question would be, maybe you should develop some more verbal skills. I don't know this for sure, Dave, you know, but generally it's useful. How do you do that? Doesn't hurt to read. Really doesn't hurt to write. You know, a little bit of writing every day clarifies your thinking. You need a value hierarchy. It's inevitable that you have a value hierarchy and that you look at the world through it, and that it should be well structured, and that there should be something of divine importance at the top. I would say what should occupy the top position is the realization, for example, that each person is of divine value, and that the most appropriate way of interacting with potential is by embodying and speaking the truth. That's not a bad way of briefly conceptualizing what might be at the highest pinnacle of the value structure. I would say that's what the logos is. And so the soul is what manifests itself in the choice between different pathways, in the choice between different ways of transforming the potential of the future into the actuality of the present. And it does that by making ethical decisions, by choosing between good and evil at each choice point. And to the degree that it chooses good, then it takes the raw potential of the future and it transforms it into the being of the present that is good. And to the degree that it does that in a manner that's evil and contaminated by malevolence and hatred and vengefulness, then it takes a pathway that corrupts the world and makes things worse. And it's the soul that's doing that, and it's the soul that's responsible for that. And it's also that active part of the soul that's shaping the deeper soul in some sense, which would be something like the cumulative consequence of all those choices, something akin to what people more classically have referred to as character. Your life doesn't have meaning without aspiration or an aim. Okay, so you need a hierarchy of values. There's got to be something at the top. It's got to be something important. If you don't have that, your life doesn't have any meaning. So if you criticize the hierarchy, or even the idea of hierarchy, you destroy the idea of aspiration, and then people have nothing. Well, that's not helpful. People are built for a struggle and they're built for a weight, and you want to take on a heavy burden voluntarily. See if you can put yourself together. See what you can do out in the world while you're waiting to die. It's an all-in game. It better be worthwhile. And so there's a tight relationship between responsibility and aspiration and hierarchy. And when you criticize those things, you get rid of the aspiration.
If you want another amazing Jordan Peterson video, check it out right there next to me. I think you'll love it. Continue to believe, and I'll see you there.
One of the fundamental theses of 12 Rules for Life and also of Maps of Meaning is that